sports has been very, very important in U.S. history. So I basically today symposium is about new frontiers and directions. So I will basically use sports, use a specific period, 1890 to 1920 as a focal point to basically to explain my so-called perspective about how to study China, including the shared history between the Chinese Americans. Professor Kirby published a very, very influential article in 1997. Of course, it's a year of significance for this place, called Internationalization of China, published in on China Quarterly. So at that article, Professor Kirby mentioned about internationalization, right? Or then eventually internalization, internationalization. So that's basically later on the international history, thanks to many giant pioneers at Harvard and elsewhere, including my former mentor Akira Yuri, become transnational history. So I basically, as a student of Harvard, also Akira Yuri, basically I practiced transnational history as much as I could. So I wrote several books in that category. So later on, where I decided to move on from the shadow of transnational history, then develop some new approach about so-called shared history. So the shared history, basically, I literally try to see how, say, the Chinese and Americans, even now, of course, are politically incorrect from Beijing's perspective, talk about shared history with that enemy. But I basically, from historian perspective, as historians, of course, have to say, to tell the truth, nothing but truth, right? Then pinpoint to the specific period, 1890 to 1920. That's, I think, is the years of significance in both countries for the Chinese and for Americans. Then use a sport to basically to demonstrate how the Chinese and Americans to use a shared ideology, shared venue or vehicle, sports, to basically to project their own nation building process. So basically, I will focus on three questions. Why was the period from 1890 to 1920 so important in both Chinese and American history? Then why can a sport perspective help us better understand the history of Chinese Americans at the turns of the 20th century, and how sports became a vehicle for Chinese national salvation, 救国, right? Then during 1890s and 1920, why at the same time Americans embraced sports as a new frontier and for national rejuvenation. So the major objective of this presentation is to demonstrate there was a strong shared theme and journey between Chinese and Americans in their respective formative national history through the lens of sports. So why this period? So anybody who studied Chinese history and American history know that's very important period. So let's start with Chinese history first. Sports, basically, I will turn to the period later, then let's see why sports. Sports, by the way, for I think now, United States, American society is quite divided. They cannot talk to each other, but with one exception, sports. So you still can talk to each other through sports. If you're in Boston, if you don't watch the Red Sox, if you basically or don't basically pay attention to Super Bowl, you're very un-American, right? Sports, to a certain extent, United States is really a sporting republic. For China, that's again, the sports provide a most revealing and penetrating view about the idea of China. By the way, for US, that's a very, very famous quote. If you don't understand baseball, you don't understand American society. So another thing about sports in this particular period is sports, of course, it's a popular culture. Also, it's a transnational in nature. By the way, especially when we talk about sports, we talk about YMCA, we talk about IOC, International Olympic Committee, Olympic movement. That's a shared domain. So I can basically say to use sports to study that period for both respective history in China, US. Eric Hobsbawm, in his very famous book called Invention of Tradition, argued that tradition usually is constructed But I will argue that sports have become a major vehicle for both Americans and Chinese to construct their respective national history at that particular moment. So Chinese, by the way, surprisingly, used to be good with sports during the Asian time. I guess some of you, I don't know, play Weiqi or Go in Japan. So the Weiqi was invented by Chinese more than 3,000 years ago, still a very popular game. Also later on, I will talk about even Henry Kissinger talk about to understand US-China relations, you have to understand Weiqi. Then we have basically surprisingly in town China, the Chinese men and women play polo. Polo, by the way, was imported from Central Asia or West Asia, but become very popular. Some emperors during the town China even get killed during the polo games. So very, very popular in town China. Then, of course, you know, basically thanks to introduction of Buddhism from India, we invented martial arts. So martial arts basically joined hand with Buddhism when they introduced to China. So the point I try to make here to compare to the modern China, in ancient China, the Chinese had so-called 尚武精神, or basically to translate that, so warlike spirit. That's of course not my discovery. I put some original quotation here. Liang Qicao, of course, very famous reformer, also the scholar at turns of the 20th century, basically literally argued Asian Chinese basically were warriors. Then, of course, very famous historian at Nankai. He came to Nankai from Tsinghua. Li Haizhen basically literally suggested, argued in Asian Chinese they were so-called noble light. Then later on, we gradually become scholar officials. In Asian China, the Chinese and Americans later on shared something in common, the warlike spirit. But later on, unfortunately, that warlike spirit or 尚武精神 get disappeared. For example, that's very famous painting in Han China. Say that a woman, she was very good with a sword. Then, of course, play polo. One woman, by the way, in town China was so obsessed with polo, when she died, she buried with her 2 donkeys. By the way, for women in town China, they have a special trained donkeys to do the trick. So tomorrow, Professor Chen Ziwu will talk about archaeology and to how from the perspective of archaeology to study history. That's actually one example here. So return to Kissinger. Kissinger in his a book called On China, he said basically if you try to understand Chinese strategically thinking, you have to understand Weiqi. So of course Weiqi, for those of you who play Weiqi or understand Weiqi, it really follows the spirit of the arts of war. Say basically we have a totally different definition of victory, because for the Chinese, the best way or best level of victory was you make your enemy surrender to you without fighting, right? That's exactly what the spirit of Weiqi. So that again is actually from Asian Chinese, long time, 3,000 years ago. Then how basically the Chinese eventually, basically in terms of spirit, into body, into mind, dispute, that basically, of course, that's have something to do with a Song dynasty. That's of course the very famous Japanese scholar argued about so-called the Tang and Song transition. I don't want, but I just give you some basic examples why the Song China and afterward declined dramatically in terms of body, mind, and spirit, then end up to be a segment of Asia. One thing, of course, is Neo-Confucianism. Professor Kirby has a colleague there, Peter Ball, wrote a very, very influential book called This Culture of Ours, really focused on Song China intellectual history. So Neo-Confucianism, of course, I'm not here in the position to argue about the pros and cons about that, but one thing, that emergence of Neo-Confucianism has done enormous damage to Chinese body, to Chinese mind, especially to Chinese women, because after Song China, basically that's a new so-called definition of beauty for both men and women. That of course came hand to hand with the emergence or institutionalization of civil service examination, starting in Song China more than 1,000 years ago. Then of course, because of Neo-Confucianism, because the civil service examinations, which was open only to men, So then, of course, from Sun China till turns of 20th century, Chinese women, Han women, basically start to burn their feet. One thing, of course, from John mentioned earlier about business, because there's something to do with business. Because after Sun China, because Chinese economy is an agriculture-based economy, they don't need the woman's labor anymore. Also because a new sense of, a new definition of so-called beauty, then the Chinese women start to think, have a 3 golden inch so-called lilies. That's a symbol of beauty or symbol of high class. So that's again, then later on, foreign invasions. So because of this, any man, or from boy to the old man, become obsessed with book learning in order to pass civil service examination. That, by the way, itself is a backward-looking exams. Just if you are expert on memorizing or understanding Confucian text, then you could pass. So then, of course, when men became less so-called man-like, then women start to burn their feet. So you can see that's a natural pair of feet. Then that's another thing. With the burn feet, literally burn your toes under the ball of your feet. That means to stand is painful. To walk is almost impossible. To run, don't think about it. So basically, in other words, by late Qing China, by the way, when I was young, I still saw some old ladies with burned feet. That's even that time. It's, the foot binding is supposed to be illegal since 1905. Then when Republic of China came to power, even they confiscated the long clothes, the binding, to say basically make sure the woman, but they still practice this. So what that gives us, that means half of Chinese population become disabled. Because that, if we assume the woman, largely Han woman, including countryside women, burn their feet, that means just half of Chinese population become disabled. So how that basically eventually, that's basically allows China becomes sick man. So that's X-ray. Then of course later on the invasion of foreigners. I think we John's talk about that when Hong Kong became colony of Great Britain. So that's basically that's a treaty signed in 1842. Then of course, then later on you can say the symbol. For example, after last dynasty came to power, woman with a bun feet, man with a queue, because in Qing China, by the way, the Manchu did not allow their women to burn their feet. They also did not like the Han Chinese woman to burn their feet, but women did not obey. But men basically, of course, in beginning refused to have a queue or pigtail. Then, of course, when they was forced to choose their head and hair, of course, men unfortunately choose to keep their head. So that basically a symbol, of course, it's a less masculine. Then, of course, the opium, so make Chinese men very weak. Then, by end of 19th century, the Chinese themselves conclude China was a sick man. I will argue the first person who called China a sick man was not the foreigner, it's Chinese. Yan Fu himself, in his article published in 1895, I use a red color there. 中国者故病夫也. To translate, China is sick man, right? That's not only, so from that moment on, of course, why he argued at that time, he argued this way, because China was defeated by Japan. So that's a wake-up call. So the Chinese conclude, progressive or conservative, they all conclude that the nation, if they don't do something dramatically, they're going to cease exist or disintegrated. So basically, Yan Fu argued the Chinese have to basically to figure out how to keep their nation, keep their race, or to basically for national salvation. Liang Qicao, I mentioned earlier, he called the Asian Chinese or warlike people. Basically, at this time, he also argued about that. 中国其人皆为病夫，其国安得不为病国也? Just sick man, right? A sick country. So that's basically then, of course, how to cure the sick man of the disease of sick man. They all, by the way, at that time, at turns of 20th century, they cry for restoring 尚武精神, the warlike spirit. Then basically, eventually, ironically, they turn to sports. for national salvation, because in order to make Chinese men and women strong, you need sports. So sports, by the way, the Chinese language, written language, exists for many, many thousands of years. But in Chinese language, we do not have a vocabulary, sports. We import it from Japan. A scholar in Taiwan basically say around 1897. So that's 体育, then became basically, so that you can say that's a transnational history perspective, because the Chinese, in order to figure out how to save their nation, then they turn to sports. Then basically they have to even basically not only the sports we talk about this, not the Asian sports, the national sports. Also, it's a really international sports from West. So we imported 体育, the 体 and 育, the two characters exist, of course, in Chinese, but put together for convey the today's meaning of sports that's imported from Japan. So the physical education curriculum also was largely imported from Japan at the turn of 20th century. That's what happened at turn of 20th century. Chinese, in order for national purpose, for nationalism, then turned to internationalize a vehicle sport. So in 1906, even the Qing court realized not only to emphasize the warlike spirit for as a crucial curriculum of education, even argued that in order to make China strong, we need a strong woman. Then basically say a woman's body and woman's health become crucial part of nationalism or national pride or nationalism. So basically, of course, Sun Yat-sen, where this university considered is one of us, he became a big fan of warlike spirit, Song Jinsen. So that's basically Sun Yat-sen, since at turns of 20th century, keep emphasize that's then also linked to 强国强准, right? Make the country strong, makes the race strong. The Zhao, the private university founded in 1919. Zhao is a big fan of sports. He later on I will talk about. He was a secretary of YMCA. So in 1936, he basically emphasized to everyone, in order to make China strong, you have to basically you have to pay attention to your intellectual rights, also to make basically your country have a strong citizens. So in other words, basically, let me just conclude a little bit for China part. Sports served as a vehicle for national salvation at turns of 20th century. So in other words, from very beginning, sports were directly linked to the national salvation, to nationalism, national pride, national honor. So that's, now let's turn to United States. For folks here who are experts of American history, that's very formative years in the United States. First of all, why 1890? Because 1890 basically, at least we can say the old frontier, the traditional frontier, according to the future historian of Harvard, basically says this exists, Jack Turner. So that's one thing, because in the United States, why they do not follow the footprint of old world or European imperialism? Because they have a frontier. They have a basically westward movement. But in 1890, that frontier or traditional frontier, according to national basically data or survey, says to exist. Also, according to economic historians of the United States, by at late 1890s, United States surpassed Great Britain as the #1 economy. So now that's with the end of old traditional frontier, then United States becomes superpower economically. Also, especially by the way, United States used like Hong Kong with a one country, two system, right? So that's before the Civil War. Then of course, the after Civil War, the United States really the one country, one system. Because by the way, my former teacher, Ernest May, always emphasized to me, say before Civil War, one says that United States as a nation is a plural, the nations. After Civil War, singular. So basically then of course, one country, one system with basically as a #1 economy. that United States have an enormous energy. They have to seize. But United States, of course, do not want to become imperialist. So there's a lot of frustration. I will talk about a little bit, the paranoid. A lot of things, of course, happened in this period. It's the urbanization. I think now that if you look at China, the same thing, the fast speed of urbanization. Urbanization, also industrialization. In 1893, when the Chicago World Expo took place, you can see the United States show off to the world through that expo about how United States became basically the industrialized nation. So during that period, it's a very, very important period in American history. On one hand, of course, at that time, United States Americans have to figure out how to go from there. So that time, of course, social Darwinism became a major shared ideology for Chinese Americans. At the same time, really make American figure how make United States American civilization strong, dynamic. So a lot of things, basically, according to the Columbia historian, Americans actually collectively suffered from, especially in that period, from paranoid and national so-called psychic crisis. Because at that time, on one hand, they were overconfident. The United States was number one. United States was very confident about their culture, about civilization. Then again, they worried about the decline of American civilization. So during that time, after end of traditional frontier, Frederick Jackson Turner, he was, of course, in 1893, gave a very famous speech at the Chicago World Fair. Of course, American Historical Association had an annual meeting there. I read basically he was the last person give a last talk in a very late evening. Very few, I think 5 people listened to his talk, significance of frontier in American history. But then, of course, he thought it was a total failure. But later on, he became the founding father of frontier history because he argued to understand American history, you have to understand the tradition of frontier. So now, with the end of frontier, everybody worried what's the next frontier for the Americans. So during that time, so that's this so-called Fred Moazzin, he basically figured out United States have to worried not to repeat the same fate of Rome Empire. They think that Rome Empire, when they become powerful, they enjoy the good life, become peaceful. So this guy argued to avoid the same fate as a Rome Empire, he asked Americans to maintain warlike spirit, 尚武精神, just like Liang Qichao, like Yan Fu and others argued. So basically say, because for the frontiers so-called men and women, you make your body very rough, right? So now with the industrialization, with the urbanization, you become a gentry class. You lost that so-called strong body or warlike spirit. So he argued this, that of course, another person, T.R. Theodore Roosevelt, he has a nickname as a Rough Rider. He self-appointed himself as a frontierman. He also basically argued strongly, in order to save American civilization from decline or to keep their vitality, he argued Americans have to make physically strong, spiritually very competitive. So I put something here, say basically, in short, in life, as a football game, the principle to follow is hit the line hard. That's, of course, for those of us who understand American baseball. You just carry American baseball, but by the way, United States is a little bit strange. Football, we're supposed to play with foot, but Americans with hand, right? Then football, basically, in US, it's not football. They have a special term called soccer, right? Anyway, so if you to understand American political culture, you have to understand sport jargon. In short, in sport, in life, as a football game, the principle to follow is hit the line hard, don't fool, and don't shoot, but hit the line hard. You touchdown, right? So that's a principle he argued. So also at that time, for many of us who have a kid growing up in the U.S., they become Boy Scouts, right? So the founder, basically, according to the founder of the Boy Scouts movement, basically he argued American manhood was improved at turns of the 20th century. We badly need some training for our lads if we are to keep up manliness in our race instead of lapsing into a nation of soft, sloppy cigarette suckers. That, by the way, the TR and others basically say why the great Chinese civilization declined. That's exactly what happened. We become too soft. So at that time, basically, even that's one famous, actually, the book, actually, she also spends brief time at Harvard. Well, I think Professor Kirby was a chairman of that. So she even wrote a very interesting book. The United States Americans get involved, the Spanish so-called, basically to taste of imperialism by fighting Spain in 1895. Because in 1898, basically she argued because it's not for imperialism. Americans fought this war simply for American manhood, according to Ghassan's thesis. So in other words, sports and strenuous life, which GR advocates strongly, became the major currency in the United States in terms of 20th century. So basically, I will try to suggest here, between 1890 and 1920, sports was advocated as a major vehicle for American national rejuvenation. By the way, that term you hear a lot in China today. Not only China Dream or Chinese Dream, also the Chinese national rejuvenation. I guess he forgot the sport. But he did emphasize the football, by the way. But unfortunately, the Chinese man sucks now. Never qualify to World Cup. But women are good. But anyway, that's a different story. So sports became, for Americans, national rejuvenation, especially the Harvard the divinity school, actually. Influential writer basically make a very convincing case. Sports would inoculate the nation against modern dangers. Sports, in his mind, would commit the nation to the quest for common good and rescue the republic from poor in my face. So basically, we can see a clear pattern that Americans collectively advocate to embrace sports for national rejuvenation at turns of 20th century. Now let me turn to how the sports served as a shared history between Chinese and American at same period, same time. One, YMCA. YMCA, by the way, originated from UK at middle of 19th century, then become, because of Americans' advocacy of sports, YMCA became a driving force in promoting sports in the United States. So YMCA, so ironically, not only plays a leading role in basically make American civilization strong, YMCA set up the first branch in China in 1895 by American secretary. So that for both Chinese and Americans, they were motivated by nationalism and transnationalism. So the social Darwinism, nationalism, and internationalism became very strong currencies in both countries, China and United States. So during the Great War or First World War, YMCA almost completely took over sports program in American military. Basically, they say before 1890, by the way, the sports and military, American military did not really was emphasized for military, but starting from 1890, then of course not only the American the holiday, the Thanksgiving, were directly linked. That's of course that's traditional holiday were linked with sports. Then basically gradually sports became very important part of American military culture. So to give you a good example, so YMCA after United States helped the Great Britain and France. So then basically United States, basically YMCA helped American military to host so-called in 1919 the Inner Allied Games in 1919 in Paris. After war was over, just say why United States became so important, so powerful, because of sport. Then basically the YMCA, I mentioned American Secretary David Willard Leon established the first YMCA branch in Tianjin, then YMCA in Shanghai. Then in 1910, by the way, we talk about national games. It's YMCA who convinced Chinese to host a national game in 1910. By the way, in 2025, Hong Kong joined hands with the Guangdong province to co-host national game, but nobody really talk about the YMCA got involved in this. From 1895 to end of 1920s, YMCA plays a leading role in sport program in China. I mentioned Zhao the founding president of Lanka University. Basically became very interested in sports because he was a secretary of WAMC in Tianjin. So that's WAMC, the shared vehicle. Then another thing, ironically, when Chinese were crying for national, cry for basically how to cure the Chinese segment of Asian disease, basically after China was defeated by the Japanese. So a Frenchman by name Pierre de Coubertin think about same thing. So in 1894, he founded, actually with the help of a Princeton historian, to found the International Olympic Movement in 1894. That's of course the beginning of the Sino-Japanese War. Then in 1895, China was defeated. Then the Chinese concluded China was segment. Then 1 year later, in 1896, the first modern Olympic game took place. Well, of course, modern Olympic Games with a slogan there or motto, higher, faster, stronger. That's exactly the Chinese want to do. Then that's exactly what Americans try to do. That's Pierre de Coubertin. So Americans, by the way, let's turn to US first. So Americans played a leading role in helping the French guy, Pierre de Coubertin, to found the modern Olympic Games. Also with a strong support from a historian, Princeton historian, William Milligan Sloan. So he was a French historian. So Pierre de Coubertin discussed with him. He strongly supported. The first Olympic gold medal, by the way, was won by Harvard student in 1896. The first gold medal won by Americans was Harvard undergraduate student. So Americans at that time really tried to use the Olympic Games to show off, to demonstrate to UK Americans are faster, stronger, than can jump higher. So really use the sport for to cultivate the national dream. The first Olympic Games United States hosted actually was in 1904 in St. Louis. The American president Theodore Roosevelt served as the honorary president. Then the director of that Olympic Games was J.E. Sullivan. He just simply declared to the world, American host the first Olympic game was the best in the world. Demonstrate Americans' advantage in sports, in athletic achievement. So basically, in other words, from very beginning, when the United States worried about their own civilization's future, about their national strength, they turned to sports. Then eventually, they decided to use sports to fight with the British about who is the number one, not only economically, even culturally, right? So from very beginning, Americans used the Olympic game to cultivate American dreams, American values. So American hosted the Olympic game in 1904. So the next one in London, 1908. For this London Olympic Games, American media were determined, would never hide that intention. United States would tell the Great Britain, tell the world who was number one. So at that time, of course, British King Edward VII declared to use that game to show the so-called final glory of his reign. But Americans were determined to use it for a new kind of spirit of 1776, then replace UK as a new superpower. So United States, of course, largely succeeded until the president of the United States openly declared we won. By the way, at that time, you talk about US-China relations, they're so-called the tricks. The British basically say in the opening ceremony, you cannot find any national flag of American national flag. When Americans are saying, where's our flag? They say, we cannot find it. Then basically the American delegation found a small national flag because when they march in front of British king, usually you have to dip your flag to show your respect to the king. Americans never did that. They hide that very hard to say, we don't care about your case. Anyway, so that's for the United States. By 1908, everybody knows United States is a new superpower, economically or culturally, perhaps not that different. So the Chinese, ironically, same thing, because they turned to sports for national salvation. In the same Olympic game in 1908, the Chinese asked three famous questions or dreams. When will China host an Olympic game? When will Chinese take part in the Olympic game? When will China win Olympic gold medal? That, by the way, through WAMC's in Tianjin, Elizabeth City, right? So in 1908, Then Olympiad, by the way, the first book was written in Chinese. That's the Wamsi journal in Tianjin, called Tianjin Yamen. That 3 questions or 3 dreams was raised, but with Wamsi, with Zhang Bonin and others, collectively, that's Zhang Bonin. Then this guy called Shen Yuhai, he also is Wamsi secretary in Hankou. The first book he wrote about Olympic game is this. Actually, I find it in our library, Hong Kong library, right? So I don't know, I'm not good photographer. So the first thing, Olympiad, if you translate into Chinese, it's called 我能比啊, I can compete. See, that's the first book. The first book written by Chinese about Olympic Games, called at that time called 世界运动会. So that's not my over-interpretation. The author himself or others realize we Chinese use the Olympiad to demonstrate to the world we can compete. 我能比啊, right? Then so on 我能比啊, 赵纯心. So that just tell you how the Chinese Americans use sports, use Olympic Games to cultivate their own national agenda. So let me close with 2 articles published on sports in 1917. 2 articles. One, I guess this article with the name 28化身, published in 1919, April 1st, 1917, with the title 体育之研究, or to translate on sports. 28化身 is a future chairman Mao. Mao Zedong, he was nobody at that time. So if you write Mao Zedong in classic language, it's a 28化, right? So he talked about how sports and Chinese nationalism or Chinese national faith were linked. So that's basically several years ago in the Guoqi in China, that's basically national examination question. Then same year in the United States, of the frontier historian, Turner student, Frederick Paxson, wrote very famous article in the same year, 1917, usually called The Rise of Sport. So in that article, he argued sports in US can serve as a new frontier for Americans and provide the safety wealth of sports was designated, built, and applied and helped introduce a new Americanism for new century. That's sports. So same year, one Chairman Mao or future Chairman Mao, at that time he was nobody. Then the frontier historians student basically say the new frontier emerged. That's sports. So basically after the 1920, sports in US become actually a national currency. It's a given. So you don't. It's a fact. So basically, let me conclude with one more thing. We talk about the new frontiers, new directions in studying Chinese history. So I do think basically now appear to say the value of sports in studying Chinese history, in studying US history, also shared history. Then basically, when the US-China relations at this time is in a very critical to or maybe affect the future of Chinese universities, I think this new approach, new perspective might give us some new ideas. Let me stop here. Thank you so much.
It's a great honor for me to be a discussant for Professor Xu Guoqi's enlightening presentation. I would like to make the following 3 points. Firstly, Professor Xu Guoqi has been a very good friend of mine for over 30 years. After graduating from Harvard, he has devoted himself to research and published a series of Chinese and English works, which has had a great impact in Chinese mainland. Chinese historians admired his scholarship very much. Second, Professor Xu Guoqi has recently studied the history of China-US relations from the perspective of shared history and sports. His research paradigm of China-US relations has deeply influenced young generations of Chinese scholars and students. It's a shockingly new approach and directions in studying history. How did sports serve a shared history between Chinese and Americans? I'm quite confident to say that no one in Chinese mainland has studied this from this perspective. Professor Xu Guoqi is the first person to conduct research from this perspective. Thirdly, Xu Guoqi's latest research focused on the role of sports in the history of China and the United States. He chose the period from 1890 to 1920 as his research focus. The period is very important historical period for both China and the United States. On the China side, the Chinese use Olympic game for national salvation and renewal. China is in a period of transition from a civilization to a nation state. The famous May 4th movement took place in 1919. China has long been known as a sick man of East Asia. Chinese were deeply worried about the fate of their race, their civilization, and their nation, and Chinese people want to revitalize China through sports. Sports were used for nation salvation. From the perspective of American history, sports for national rejuvenation is the key words. Americans use Olympic game for achieving its national dream as a country of stronger, faster, and higher. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, the United States began to move toward the world. According to the statistics such as 1819 U.S. Census, the traditional frontier of the U.S. no longer exists. In other words, finding a new frontiers for Americans has become an important issue for Americans since the 19th century. Through sorting and analyzing historical data, Professor Xu Guoqi believes that sports have become a new frontier in the eyes of American middle class and the elites. In a word, Professor Xu Guoqi's new approach to use transnational history and shared history through the lens of sports is extremely fresh and powerful. He paid attention to sports, paid attention to the shared history, and paid attention to the shared journey between American and Chinese at the turn of 20th century. His research made a great contribution to have better understanding of the long journey of nation building of the United States and China. That's my short comments. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Zhao. It's very kind. I guess I should, open up. Yeah, if you have time. Oh, of course, we always have time for you.
I just want to just say thank you for that wonderful presentation and very imaginative presentation. Just two thoughts, one on the Chinese and then on the American side. And, the idea of the sick man of Asia, as you show, is a powerful idea. But of course, it's a very late idea. Not till Yanfu does anyone come up with this. And it's a way of explaining current weakness. But if the Chinese had become so unwarlike, I'm sure you know this, how did they fight so many wars? From Song to Yuan to Ming to Qing. How did the Qing conquer that? Anyway, that's a different story. I don't believe that myth but it was a very useful myth in the creation of the mobilization of nationalism. So that's just one small point. On the American side, just a small story. The one thing, baseball is very important. It becomes a mass sport, late 19th and particularly first part of the 20th century. But relates to this work on universities, one of the extraordinary things about the rise of American universities and the popularization of the idea of universities is football, American football, the real football. Not really the real football, but American football becomes a national obsession in the exact same period. And the idea of football and collegiate spirit and football, every American university today that has songs that the students know, they're almost all written in that period of time. How do 10,000 men of Harvard crush Yale, this kind of thing. And Harvard, just one little anecdote, it shows you both the rise and fall maybe of American civilization. So Harvard built the first major reinforced concrete building in the United States in the form of Harvard Stadium in 1903. It defined the modern game of football. It sought 40,000 people in the original horseshoe. It then was so popular that it expanded to a 65,000 seat. It was filled every Saturday. And Harvard, most people don't know this, won 7 national championships in football. The last one was in 1920, so it's been a while. But right at the end of your period, exactly right. And then if you look at this, and maybe this is something one should worry about, of course we haven't done so well since, and this stadium that used to sit 65,000 was then reduced back to the original 40,000 horseshoe. And then a number of years ago, shortly before I was dean, we renovated the stadium and we renumbered the seats. And today that same stadium seats only 30,000 people compared to 40,000 because the rear ends of Americans today are so much larger than they were in 1903. This is something that would alarm Theodore Roosevelt very greatly. That's all I have to say.
Let me just add one thing about the games between Harvard and the university. You don't want to name the name. In 1968, the next year, of course, your predecessor was basically, because the policemen were called to Harvard to organize but before that year, in 1868, the game between Harvard and Yale, that's so classic, because 45 seconds earlier, Yale was dominant. The Yale student can claim they have a guard to serve as a quarterback. But in last 45 seconds, Harvard came back with a score.
2 scores.
29-29. The Crimson on Monday say Harvard beat Yale 29-29. Then that's a very famous, later on, very famous actor, Tommy Lee Jones. He was a player for that. He later on, of course, won Oscar. People ask him, what's a defining moment in your life? Say, that game. Then, of course, when JFK was running for White House, he said he was ready because he played the football for Harvard. See, if you play as a president, just like you beat Yale every Saturday, just every day like that. So that basically, my understanding now, I think basically maybe to serve a Chinese foreign minister, put the sports guy there to talk to Americans, then get excited. Anyways.
Yes, Guoqi, thank you for your talk. There are 2 points. One is I think you left the British out of China because the British were the real sportsmen in China for a long, long time, right? So they brought in soccer, right? Which is in many ways the Chinese national game. I mean, right. Ping pong too, yeah, a number of things. We never took up cricket, but soccer was big, yeah. So many of the sports clubs in China were actually founded by the British, run by the British, and the schools, right, too. The other thing is, I'm really surprised that you overemphasize the foot binding of Chinese women. A lot of women did not bind their feet, all right? Elizabeth would know. I mean, the courtesans and the daughters of rich officials and rich merchants did bind their feet, but there are a lot of women, servants, people who worked on farms, worked in the marketplaces, did not bind their feet. Now, I don't have the statistics, and I don't know whether anybody has done research. So for you to say that half of China, people were disabled because of foot binding, I think it's a bit of an exaggeration, and I think you might want to look into it a bit more.
All right.
And women were very productive too, because many women who did not bind the feet were very productive.
Okay, good question. Maybe I did not address Professor Kirby's question earlier about the Chinese fought so many wars. By the way, at that time, according to even Sun Yat-sen, I mean, Mongols were not considered Chinese. The Manchus were not either. Manchu women did not bind their feet, by the way.
A lot of Han women.
But most of Han women actually, indeed. But for example, Bill Kirby mentioned Hu Shi. Hu Shi's wife had a bind feet.
But they were a different class.
No, basically, but the problem at that time, foot binding was supposed to be illegal. That's basically, that's Hu Shi got married after he returned to China. That's still arranged marriage, but his wife was illiterate, bind the feet. But I mentioned, when I was kids, a lot of village women in my village still have a band, but not of course 3-inch golden lilies, but they tried. But again, the foot binding is so taboo to study, because remember the Marco Polo travel, one criticism of that book says it's a fake, because you did not mention the foot binding. But again, nobody know, because for women with a bound feet, the bound feet is the most sensitive part of body. Usually they even don't allow their husband to see without binding clothes. But again, that basically just it's gradual. In the beginning in Sun China, only the top class women bind their feet to say they don't need to work. They basically they have a developed new set. But by Qing China, the Great Qing Empire, a lot of them. So that again we don't know, but actually there's several studies done, because for Republican China in 1930s, the Chiang Kai-shek government indeed sent the officials to individual household, to confiscate the binding clothes. But the problem is they are very the money making. They basically prepared that, say you take away, then they have more there to bind their feet again. So again, we don't know, but it's a widespread. Maybe not to say every Han woman bind their feet, maybe it's another, but at least a lot of women. You can see, even in Hong Kong, by the way, Hong Kong in theory is a colony, but that's the small feet woman in Hong Kong. So again, maybe we need to do more study on that, but very difficult to have a figure. In 1930s, the nationalist government tried to get the figure, but people just fake it, because they say no band feet woman, because it's supposed to be illegal, but indeed they have them. So again, thank you so much for the questions.
Yeah, I think we probably have time for one more question, if there's a question in the audience. Anyone? Professor Mülhan?
I ask a quick question to John Wang, and I get your point about the Greater Bay Area, and I also get the concerns, but I'm not sure if it's really merely administrative, because I think you can also look at it from a different perspective. And so Hong Kong businesses went into the Delta, however you call it, after reform and opening up, and it did actually produce quite a lot of, or quite tight economic integration. So there is certainly an economic dimension to it, and maybe you can comment shortly. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that question. Yes, that totally changed dynamics in between Hong Kong and mainland China in that particular period. As a matter of fact, that's how we got our factories in Hong Kong and moved the production north of here. Now, the proposition, I think, is a little bit different from what it is now in a couple of ways. One, the Hong Kong business people were in charge. They were outsourcing the production to poorer people, the poor cousins north of here. So there's still a sense of good feeling in this particular city at that moment in time. Two, the proposition now is a little bit different in that Hong Kong businesses are not really manufacturing north of the border anymore. It is looking at Shenzhen, manufacturing something that's higher value that we cannot make here. And that has generated a lot of animosity between Hong Kong and our mainland Chinese compatriots. And I think that is also back to Ghassan's earlier question. That caught us by surprise. It happened only in the last 20 years or so, and all of a sudden you look around and say, okay, I thought they were the poor cousins. Maybe not anymore. And I think that is what history hopefully would help us a little bit appreciate that sense of complexity as we look at earlier rounds and also as we chart our way forward from this point on. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
So what remains for me to do is please join me and thank again Professor Xu, Dr. Wong, and Professor Zhao.